This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, dear tram friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I'm glad to welcome you to the first appointment after the Christmas break and this cycle of international conferences. And today's presentation will be made from England by Michael Russell, that all of you know. And as you certainly know, Michael is the author of an excellent book on the same topic. This is the Tramways of Upper Silesia, a book edited by the LRTA. The presentation will be done in English, and at the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English or in Italian. And you can also use the chat in every moment during the presentation. I remind you that program of the forthcoming presentation, the complete program until June, is ready and available on our internet site. And the next presentation is scheduled for Tuesday, 11th February, and it will deal with the history of tramways in Hamburg, Germany. Thank you. And before giving the floor to Michael, I repeat everything in Italian. Cari amici del tram, buonasera, benvenuti al primo appuntamento internazionale dopo la pausa estiva. Questa sera abbiamo il piacere di avere con noi Michael Russell dall'Inghilterra, che è un veterano ormai per
Ich habe eben erzählt, einer hier aus Irland, mit dem bestimmt gestorben war.
È anche l'autore.
Der hat auch nie Mitgliederhaus gehabt.
Okay. Dicevo che Michael è anche autore di un bel libro con lo stesso titolo della presentazione di stasera, cioè i tram della Slesia superiore, e che è pubblicato dalla LRTA inglese. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese, alla fine ci sarà spazio per domande in inglese o in italiano, potete usare la chat quando volete durante la presentazione. Il programma completo fino a giugno delle prossime presentazioni è pronto ed è disponibile sul sito internet. La prossima presentazione sarà tra 15 giorni, martedì 11 febbraio, e riguarderà i tram di Amburgo in Germania. Bene, ed ora passiamo a, devo condividere io, alla presentazione di Michael. Just a moment. Okay. Does everyone see?
And the next one, please.
Okay, it's up to you, Michael. You can start.
Right, Robert. Yes. The next, please. Yes. Right. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining me this evening. Oh, can you go back, Robert? Yeah.
Yeah.
Roberto. This evening's talk is about tramways of Upper Silesia. It's not the first time I've given this talk, and I found on the last occasion that it was quite impossible to compress the whole story of this remarkable tramway into one presentation. So I have decided to divide it into two, and tonight's presentation will deal from the inception of the tramway in 1894 until the end of the Second World War in 1945. There will be a second part on a date to be announced probably later this year. When a well-known English tramwayman reviewed my book, in Tramway Review, he wrote, and it's so true, this is a story of a remarkable tramway, of which there have been many in Europe and across the world, but almost uniquely for those that have lasted until today, it is one that has a happy ending. And that's one of the striking things. This is a tramway which has actually had to put up with the most terrible difficulties and vicissitudes during its existence, but it's still there. And I'm pleased to say that it's prospering. And if you stay with me until the end of the presentation, I hope you will be impressed. Upper Silesia. Silesia itself is a province of what was Prussia, now Germany, and it had oscillated between various of the great powers during the Middle Ages. In the early 16th century, it was taken over by Austria, and it went into decline until Prussian armies on the direction of the great Elector invaded in 1742, and they were under instructions to take the territory and to develop it to the benefit of Germany and the German residents. And a large German population moved into the area to help develop the territory. It was largely agricultural at the time, but there had been a history of mining in the area, some of which was worked out as early as the 14th century. In parts of the land, such as Tarnowski Dori, there had been silver mining and zinc mining, and then things just pottered on until in the latter half of the 18th century, somewhere around the early 1780s, I think, extensive coal reserves were discovered in the area. And this was the catalyst for the transformation of Upper Silesia. German management was moved in quite quickly to take charge of the mines and develop them using a Polish workforce. German management, Polish workforce. Therein were the seeds of bitter dispute decades later. The mines really blossomed, and the huge coal deposits in the area were a source of great wealth. And of course, in those days, the mines were owned by individual landowners. And by the early part of the 19th century, they had come to the conclusion that they needed a better means of transporting their minerals from the mines themselves to the railheads. And although there were, from the 1840s onwards, railways in the area, they didn't really serve the mining districts, and the mine owners decided to develop their own network of narrow gauge lines, and it became a network known as the fiscal railways. They were laid to 785 millimeters gauge. That's just short of 3 foot in imperial measurements. And if it sounds daft today, it wasn't then, because bear in mind that at this time, the area was part of Prussia. Prussia had its own system of measurements, principal one of which was the zoll, and 30 zoll equaled just under 3 foot, 3 imperial feet. And for that therefore was 785 millimeters, and that was the gauge chosen for the fiscal railways. These developed and were quite clearly laid in order to benefit the mining trade. There was no intention at that time for the operation of passenger services, which I think were seen possibly to get in the way of the transport of minerals, and also the lines had been laid with a view to serving the mines and not the areas where the workforces lived. As the 1800s progressed, the workforce increased incredibly quickly, and the mine owners began to realize that actually it would benefit them if they could have some form of transport to get their mine workers between their places of work and the mines. Discussions took place with interested parties as to the possibility of running passenger services over the fiscal railways. But all these discussions came to naught. The mine owners themselves didn't like the prospect of passenger services getting in the way and delaying the free movement of their mineral trade. Equally, the possible operators of the passenger services didn't cherish the thought of timetabled services being disrupted by the passage of long freight trains. And eventually the prospects of running passenger services over the fiscal railways were dropped, but the idea of having transport facilities for the workers took root. And by the early 1880s, a number of individual promoters had put forward proposals for the development of a system of what we would now call tramways. And it was very interesting. They were all independently developed. None of them spoke to the others, I think. But all of the proposals had something in common, and that thing was that whatever else they wanted to do or not do, they all wanted to serve the east-west corridor between Gleiwitz and Königshütte. Königshütte was the scene of that great mine and steelworks that sprang up in the late 1780s and 90s to exploit one of the main coal deposits, and it became the hub of the coal field at that time. Gleiwitz was a very old settlement, went right back to the 1100s, and was a principal trading route and a meeting point, a crossing point on north, south and east, west trading routes in the area. So that seemed to be an extremely important destination, apart from which the railways had opened a big new station at Gleiwitz in the 1840s. So there was a good opportunity for transshipment there. Some of the other proposals were a bit weak-kneed, but one of the other principal ones that seemed to attract a bit of interest was the prospect of connecting Königshütte with Beuthen, which was the main administrative centre for Upper Silesia, located to the north. In a moment, we'll have a look at the next slide, please. Roberto, if we can have the next slide, please.
Yes, there it is.
It's not the one I wanted. All right. Well, we'll leave that for the moment. And ultimately, a firm proposal was advanced by a Berlin firm who'd secured financial backing from a firm of bankers based in Berlin, and they put forward a fairly concrete proposal, which was actually to construct from Gleiwitz east to Königshütte and then north to Beuthen. In other words, a line shaped like an L laid on its side. This was the only really worked up proposal that had a reasonable chance of moving forward. Of course, it wasn't easy to get permission. The first thing that had to happen was that the proposers had to go to the administrative authority in Beuthen. Now, these days, if you go to Beuthen, what is now called Bittom, which is at the northern edge of the Upper Silesian industrial area, you have the impression of a town, I don't wish to be unkind, but a town which is rather down at heel and has seen better days. But in the 1880s and 90s, it was a hub of activity, and everything of any importance happened there or was controlled by the municipal authorities in Beuthen. So getting there okay to constructing the tramway was vital, and that was fairly easily forthcoming, although, as always with local authorities, they laid down conditions as to what had to be done as part of the construction, such as not running in this street and that street, keeping clear of the marketplace on market days, a bit of street lighting and so forth, but generally not overly onerous conditions. It was also necessary to negotiate with the other authorities on the line of route, Gleiwitz, Zabrze, Königshütte. But they obviously did their work well and got their permissions and their authorities, and construction started in 1893. It was intended from the outset to use steam traction, and I don't blame them, because this was going to be a line over 30 kilometers from end to end, which is an extremely ambitious undertaking for a first line in an area that didn't have anything of the sort. But events proved that their confidence was well placed. And although it had originally been intended to use Rowan steam cars, which had been used in France, in practice, conventional steam tram engines were eventually chosen. And here's a picture of one in its later days. They were built in Düsseldorf, and a series of 30 of them were ordered for delivery in 1894. The gauge was the subject of considerable discussion. Originally, it had been intended to operate on standard gauge, but that was quickly dashed when it was realized how many tight curves there would be, difficult junctions, because the area, although rich in minerals, was not well developed in infrastructure. And before long, it was decided, in fact, that the promoters decided that they would opt for meter gauge, and they took their worked up proposals for a meter gauge network to the railway authority based in Oppeln, who had to give their authority because the tramway would come under railway jurisdiction. And the railway authority made quite a number of observations which cost the company a lot of money. But one of the things that they insisted upon was that they should lay to 785 millimeter gauge, so that it was totally compatible with the gauge used by the fiscal railways. And in the event of war, not too far on the horizon, one suspects, in the event of war, that there would be the opportunity for interrunning between the two networks. In fact, that never happened, but that's another story. So the gauge was laid at 785, but construction, although it proceeded apace, was held up by two major projects. There were several important infrastructure developments in the course of the line, one of which was a massive junction near Lipini, where the tramway was going to cross the railway lines that led to the Lipini colliery. But far worse was one on the outskirts of Gliwice. Now, in this district, the land was, and I would say still is, quite boggy, and it was not possible for them to secure good foundations for a bridge that had to be constructed over what was then the main railway line of the mainline railways. It was rerouted later, but that's not relevant to the story. And there was a real prospect, apparently, that the entire project would founder on the fact that they seemed unable to secure a bridge of sufficient strength and rigidity to support the weight of the steam tram train. But eventually the German engineers solved the problem, and I think with an enormous amount of piling into the ground beneath there, a bridge was constructed of such rigidity, such strength, that when it opened in 1894, nobody could have imagined that it was still in service when tramway operations ceased on that line in August 2009, 115 years of operation. So that was one problem that had to be overcome. And the second one was on the outskirts of Boyton. Now, I have to emphasize the outskirts, because at that time, the boundaries of Boyton were very tightly drawn, and the adjacent local authority was Rosbach, as we now know it, or Rosberg, as it was then, Red Hill. And at this point, the fiscal railways had their main marshalling yard with a huge network of tracks that crossed the main road right at the boundary between Rosberg and Boyton. And the railway commissioners recoiled at the prospect of trams crossing this enormous network of railway tracks on the level. And having surveyed the area, their verdict was that they would only give permission if a tunnel were constructed to take the tramway beneath the network of fiscal railway lines. This was 1894, a very early date for a tramway tunnel or subway, but the company buckled down and built the tunnel. It, of course, was single track, like the whole of the line, and it was built for use by steam locomotives, and it was just over 450 meters in length, so not inconsiderable. And once these works have been completed, that first line could be opened in its entirety. And the first section was opened in May 1894. At the western end of the route, the terminus was at Gliwice. At the northern end, it was at a point called Pikary-Śląski. Now, this was not actually in Boyton itself, and one of the problems here was a desire to serve the collieries on the section of route leading to Pikary-Śląski, as well as the fact that there was quite intensive pilgrimage traffic. There was a church at the terminal point at Pikary-Śląski, which attracted lots and lots of pilgrims, and the tramway company saw good prospects for traffic. It wasn't possible to serve Boyton by the same means. In those days, there was no direct acceptable route between Königshutter and Boyton. That came later, and the tramway therefore did not run into Boyton town or city centre. Passengers for Boyton had to get off just over a mile to the east of the town centre and the railway station. This was obviously unsatisfactory, and in the following year, the company laid a spur line from a junction with the original Pikary-Śląski line at a point known as Pogoda. And that name survives to this day, although the building is no longer there. Pogoda was in fact a great big wine lodge and restaurant run at that junction by quite an enterprising man. He was well known in the district, and even today, if you go there, you'll find that on the replacement bus route to Pikary-Śląski, the nearest stop to the junction is still known as Pogoda, even though his restaurant was demolished about 80 years ago. A line was laid, a single track line was laid from a junction at Pogoda through the street track of Boyton to Boyton Station. And that too was operated by a steam tram, apparently running a return service every half hour. Now, those of you who know Boyton will realise that it is a working town, one where the housing is geared in the central area at least towards the working classes, and although some of the buildings are not unattractive, it's not really a tourist potential. But the Boyton Town Council threw up their arms at the prospect of their town being despoiled by these nasty, dirty steam trams coming through their streets, and petitioned the company to take them off. And the result was one of those very, very rare occasions in tramway history where mechanical traction was replaced by animal traction, because the company bought some four-wheel trailer cars to use on this shuttle service and engaged a stud of horses, and for the next 5 years ran a shuttle service between Pogoda and Boyton Station using horse-drawn rolling stock. Can we have the next picture, please? I mentioned about the bridge at Gleiwitz, and this is a picture of the bridge in post-war days. It is in fact a very sturdy construction. Later on, it was faced with white stone and very, very smartly turned out. But the railway lines, which originally were part of the main line, were later diverted, and the railway tracks became connectional facilities towards marshalling yards. The bus is heading towards Zabrze from Gleiwitz. Right. Next, please. And here's a latter-day view, in fact, extremely latter-day, because I believe it's taken on the last day of operation in 2009, when the bridge has been very smartly turned out. As you can see, all the railway tracks have been removed, although the crossing sign has not. and the tram is still using the same bridge as the steam trams did when the line was first opened. Next, please. This is the junction at Pagoda, with a big interchange of rolling stock and passengers. And you can see some of the lines in the foreground. The company's lines were all single track at this stage, so shunting manoeuvres were quite commonplace, and passing loops apparently were very infrequent. They were greatly increased in number later on, but at the opening time, the passing loops were infrequent. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying that only about 4 tram sets were in operation at any one time on the main line. When you consider they bought 30 steam tram locomotives, it was a little bit over the top. But the company could claim that they were right because their hunch had been vindicated, and by the end of 1894, only with 7 months operation, they were able to declare an operating profit, which I think was very good for a single track tramway running at not particularly frequent intervals on single track over 31 kilometers of track. Now, the company had in their mind's eye the prospect of operating many more lines, but they wanted to see how the first one went. But by 1894's end, they come to the conclusion that they were onto a winner and they needed to get going with plans for other lines. And there were many. The first one that was intended to be built was one from Boyton to Königshütte, the long way round, as I'll call it. And again, those of you who know the network, it's effectively what is today Line 9 and has been Line 9 for 120 years. But they got stopped in their tracks because, as always with this sort of thing, when somebody develops a good idea, others want to jump on the bandwagon. And one of the landowners between Boyton and Hebsey, Morgenroth, thought that he could frustrate the company's ambitions because he actually owned part of what we would call the public highway between those 2 points. And the company found that unless they could buy him off, that they were going to be unable to construct this complete line. They did, in the event, buy him off, but it put back their plans by a couple of years. And in the meantime, there had been another development. One of the big landowners in the area, one of the nobility that owned a lot of land, including land on which mining was being worked, thought that it would be a good idea if he operated his own tramway to get his workers from Hortzhof, or as it is today, or Königshütte, through towards Hebsey, Morgenroth, and put forward proposals for a meter gauge line, which had a great advantage in terms of rigidity and stability and so forth, but much more importantly, to be worked by electricity. And this really galvanized the company because quite clearly steam traction was of the past. And if somebody was going to come on with electric traction to compete with them, all their investment was going to be brought to nothing. And this caused them to rework their plans. And that in itself put back the opening of the number 9 line, whilst the whole thing was rejigged for electric operation. And in fact, the next lines that opened were in fact in Katowice. Bear in mind that they hadn't been running in Katowice hitherto. Next, please. This is a view of the original Gliwice depot, which opened in 1894. There were 3 depots serving that first line, one at Gliwice, one at Rosbach, the biggest one, with engineering facilities, and one opened a bit later at Łagiewnicki. This is the original Gliwice depot, which was closed in 1972 and replaced by one on a new site. Next, please. This is a view of the depot at Rosberg under construction. It was built in 2 or 3 stages and opened for 1894. And I think, from what I can gather, was the principal depot for that original line, even though it was not centrally situated. It was situated actually on the northern spur that went up to Pikary Śląskie. But Rosberg depot remained in operation for narrow gauge rolling stock right through until 1942. Next, please. Now, and here is a map showing you the early steam and horse tramway routes. You can see to the left Gliwice, and the dotted red line, which indicates 785mm gauge horse and steam tramways through Zabrze, the Morgenrot, which will take on a great significance later in tonight's story, up to Königshütte, where at that time, when the route was opened, the trams used to have to reverse because there was no direct curve from the west to the north. And then the long section north from Königshütte through to Pagoda, Rosberg, and on to Deutsch-Pikar. You can see Rosberg depot there, marked just on the Deutsch-Pikar section, and Gliwice depot just before the final kink there in the track towards Gliwice station. Over to the right, you can see a red dotted line, which indicates the steam tramway that was opened in Katowice in 1896. At that time, the company had wanted to terminate its first line in Katowice at Katowice Marketplace, understandably. It was the hub of the town. And Katowice at that time was a relatively small settlement. The population, about 1899, was still only just over 4,000 inhabitants. When you consider its size now, that is an amazing transformation. And very quickly, it built up in terms of population and overtook Boyton as a great administrative centre for the Upper Silesia industrial region. The line was built to go north from Katowice centre to Alfred Gruber, and then turning to the northeast to Laurahütte, which was an important mine, which only closed a few years ago. Some of these mines have been going well over 200 years. And there was a depot, a temporary depot built near Laura-Huta, and amazingly, despite all the research by the Polish tramway people, who have been fantastic, I have to say, in unearthing details of the early years of this tramway, nobody has ever been able to pinpoint exactly where the original Laura-Huta depot was. It didn't last long. We think it closed in about 1904, but it certainly existed there, and was the scene of a nasty accident when one of the steam locomotives overturned. Anyhow, that was opened as a steam line, but it was also decided that it would be a good place in which to experiment with electric traction. And when overhead equipment and general infrastructure was delivered, this was a route that was poled up, if you like, and wired up for electric traction, and so was a new connection between Martedì, that's the terminus of the steam tramway in the south at Katowice, and Königshuta, and they opened on the 1st of October 1898. And the tramway company these days recognises that day, 1st of October 1898, at the day on which its current operations started. It ignores the 4 years of steam operation that preceded them. It's a bit unfair, but it has become an enormous electric tramway, and that is their view. So October 1898. Right, okay. So next, please. I mentioned the horse cars that were operated to Boyton Station, which is the building that you see there in this photograph. And this is a very rare photograph taken at Boyton Station during the era of horse car operation. We think it was taken towards the end of the horse operation, which lasted only until 1899. Because by that time, electricity was king, and the whole of the original main line, which was known to the locals as the Kramer line, because the company was Kramer and Company of Berlin, it was known as the Kramer line, and that was all converted within a 6-month period to electric traction, and steam traction finished in 1899. Next, please. Now, this is a photograph in Zabrze, taken during steam days, so somewhere between 1894 and 99. It's a very rare photograph, showing the sinuous single track threading its way through Zabrze with a steam tram locomotive there. And it looks as though it's drawing a rake of mixed stock, which in the early days was something that the tramway company did do, and indeed had intended to develop freight operation, but that was not a successful venture, and it was quietly dropped early in the 20th century. Next, please. This is typical of the rolling stock that started operations when electricity was king on the tramways. And as you say, it was quite advanced for those days, because the company, or I should say now the companies, and we'll just come on to that, companies in fact went for bogie cars. And this is understandable with some quite long journeys that were undertaken by tram right across the area, and there's plenty of capacity therefore. But one very interesting factor is the difficulty which the company has had in obtaining anybody to build them trams, and particularly the trucks, capable of accommodating a motor sufficiently powerful to power cars like this on 785mm gauge tracks. And eventually the solution fell upon Walker and Company, who were a London-based firm, or at least their London offices dealt with the contract, although it has been suggested that some of the material originated in Canada. I don't know. I don't think we really know. But certainly these cars, which had a very long life, were always known by the company as Walker cars, and quite heavily rebuilt, particularly by having enclosed platforms. Some of them were still in service at the end of narrow gauge operation in 1952. Next, please. This is an example of one of their summer trailers, and well laden. It's actually a photograph taken in later years, and would have been pressed into service during the Second World War. But the car itself had not been seriously modified. And you might think, well, how on earth have you got photographs like that taken during the war when photography was virtually banned? But there were occupying forces stationed in the area, some of whom were tramway enthusiasts, or at least one or two, and during the course of their duties snapped the odd photograph of the Upper Silesian tramways, for which, if nothing else, we should be grateful. Next, please. Here's a closed version of one of these trailer cars. These cars were all built for electric service. Some of the trailers for steam service did survive, but not long. There were some four-wheel trailers also that survived, but the main batch of rolling stock was ordered for 1898 and 99, and as I say, it was a lot of it was still in service during the Second World War. Next, please. Now we're looking at some modernized rolling stock, and as you can see, the motor car has been rebuilt with glazed platforms, and quite smartly turned out, I think. The trailer not so rebuilt. Those who went in the trailer had to endure the elements more. This is a view taken at Gleiwitz depot. Next, please. Now, one of the lines that was built as for electric traction with no prior steam operation was a major connecting line direct between Boyton and Zarbsche, what is today line 5, and remains after all these years the principal means of transport, public transport, between those two regional centres. There's no through bus service, and you go by tram. And the actual alignment is largely, but not entirely, unaltered. here's a view of one of these early bogie cars passing through the district of Biskupitz. The restaurant there on the left, Saalgarten, says that is still there. Next, please. And here we have a view on the Kramer line near Lipini, between Piasniki and Lipini, which is the part of the central section of the original Kramer line of 1894 after conversion to electric traction. And you can see, probably just make out that we're here at a passing loop, and the line goes into single track just beyond the tram. Next, please. Here's another view in that general district of Lipini. Again, one of the early bogie motor cars. This section, one of several actually, all laid as single track and never doubled until very, very recently. And as part of the reconstruction works that have taken place in the last couple of years, this is one of the sections that has had a long-term closure and has reopened as double track. So it's taken a while, but we got there in the end. Next, please. Now, also, competition did start up. There was a firm in Katowice, Sikora and Wolf, who had obtained licenses for tramway operations through Katowice Town Council, who I think had their nose put out of joint by virtue of the fact that the Kramer company would not run a horse tram service between Martedì and Katowice Market. And they gave a license to the Oberschlesische Kleinbahn to run a tramway through Katowice on an east-west axis. And it won't surprise you to learn that this infuriated the Kramer company, who did everything they could to frustrate them, but they were unsuccessful. Next, please. In the period 1899-1900, massive change came over the whole scene. And here we see a little four-wheeler used on a local service within Katowice between Załęże, which is just to the west of Katowice, and Jaworski to the east, a through journey of probably about 5 kilometers, something like that, quite small by the standards of Upper Silesia. Now, these people, the OKE, had in mind to run an extremely long line, starting at Boyton and coming down I think must have been fairly newly graded route through Świętochłowice and Bismarckhuta to Katowice and on through Chopinitz down to Mysłowice. That's a distance of 30 kilometers, give or take a few feet. And it was a massive undertaking. And the Kramer company did their best to frustrate them at every turn. For example, at the point at Piasniki, where the two lines would have crossed at right angles, the Kramer company refused to give permission to cut their tracks. Said, nope, not having that. You can run either side, but you're not coming across. It's all very petty, but fairly typical of how things were in those days, I think. And at Świętochłowice, there was a section of about half a mile where it was going to be necessary for the two trams to share roadway or even share track. And the Kramer Company was having nothing to do with that, even though at that point they didn't run over them because they got running rights for their proposed Line 9, the long way round line, the opening of which had been deferred, and they weren't going to have these people muscling in on their potential traffic. The Oberschlesier had a friend in the owner of one of the mines at Świętochłowice, and he offered to give them some land adjacent to some of his sand pits on which they could lay a single-track tramway and avoid using the roadway that the Kramer Company was intending to use. The Oberschlesier was very happy to take up this, and indeed the line was laid. Next, please. And in 1899, they started operation with this diversionary route of about half a mile that allowed them at least to get up to the contested crossing point at Piasniki. And here's one of their bogie cars out there, probably on a test run, we think, or maybe a school's journey, but I think a test run somewhere between Świętochłowice and Katowice. Next, please. Now, before the tramway actually reached Świętochłowice, it went through this junction at Bismarckhutte, where another line was thrown off going to the north behind the tram that you see crossing in front of the photographer there. There is a road that leads up to Königshutte, and the company also intended to lay a line, a branch line up there, as well as another one a little distance away, which is known as the Haiduki line. Next, please. This is the other end of the OKE's intended line, or open line, to Mysłowice. This is right at the other end of the conurbation, and in fact, quite literally, only a few hundred yards from the border with the Habsburg Empire, Austria at that time. But the tramways of Upper Silesia never actually made any incursion into Austrian land, even though there was a measure of industry in them, but not as heavy as, for example, in Mysłowice, which had a very big pit with 3 headstocks. This is coming into the terminus at Mysłowice station. Next, please. This is the diversionary route that was taken by the OKE trams when they were denied use of the public highway in Świętochłowice. And this is the street today, probably unchanged really from when it was served briefly by trams for 6 years, but obviously very good tram territory, and has no public transport service along it at all today. Next, please. This is the point at which the diversionary route went off. The block of flats in the background was eventually erected by the mine owner when he took his land back, but it stands on the site of where a branch line went off here and went through the land occupied by the block of flats and then along the riverbank into the street that I've just shown you before rejoining the company's intended line on the way into Świętokłowice. The rolling stock here, just briefly mention, is a pair of Constal 111N cars, which are double-sided, single-ended, and can be coupled back to back to make a two-car train to run double-ended formation, because in recent years the company has only operated single-ended stock with one or two very minor exceptions. That has now changed, but these cars were bought for a specific purpose, which you'll hear about in part 2 of the talk. Next, please. This is a plan showing you the layout of the line proposed by the OKE, Boyton there at the top, and then down to Świętokłowice, to Bismarck, and then through to Katowice, there down to the right towards Chopinitz, and eventually down to Mysłowice, the bottom right of the of the paper. I just mention, if I may, this little line here. We'll talk about that in a minute. Quite an important line. We call it the Lipini line. Very, very full of character, and it's only just been doubled after 120 years. Next, please. Now, this is at the junction at Königshütte, and this is almost certainly after the original line, the Kramer line, was reorganized and split into 2 abutting services. The road to the left there, we see, leads down to Gliwice, and the road straight ahead, which no longer carries trams, they're on a private right-of-way behind the housing, that leads up to Boyton. And there's one of the Kramer Company's bogie cars. Next, please. Now, the situation at Świętokłowice was clearly unacceptable. There was plenty of potential traffic for both companies, if only they could be reasonable. And eventually, a third company, which became the owner of the 2 companies, the sort of holding company, the SKB, was formed, and their management knocked heads together. And thereafter, the 2 companies worked in reasonable harmony. Not saying there weren't the odd dispute, but much better, until in 1910, the whole operation was bought by the AEG. Next, this, by the way, is at Boyton Station. And now I have to just mention that the original terminal point for trams in Boyton was here on a pair of stub tracks at Boyton Station, but it was rather unsatisfactory. And in 1905, a new loop was opened through the town with the trams going up one street and coming back down another. And that seemed to work much better, and indeed served the town better. And interestingly, although trams no longer served Wortsworth Street or Bahnhofstrasse as it was then, when the road was reconstructed about 20 years ago, excavations revealed quite a bit of the narrow gauge track was still down. It had just been covered over. And in a very nice twist, I like to hear this, people who are proud of their history, a section of the track was kept, and relayed down exactly on the right gauge, 785 millimeters, just as a memorial to their original tram loop through Boyton. Next, please. We haven't seen any views actually in Gleiwitz yet. This is a view. Gleiwitz, of course, is on the canal, a very important canal, and the trams had a couple of bridges over it. This, as you see, is in Wilhelmstrasse, which is one of the main streets in Gleiwitz. And after electric traction was introduced, a network of local lines was introduced in Gleiwitz to supplement the original line, which had terminated at the railway station. Next, please. This is a view taken at the north end of the Boyton Loop, introduced in 1905, as you see in Hohenzollernstrasse. This street is still served by trams, though with single track standard gauge, of course, for cars going in the opposite direction. But that was the terminal point, and the impression I have is, looking at the timetables, that the trams did not stay here very long. They took their main layover at the other terminals. Next, please. Now here is a map showing you the way in which the network had developed by 1912. I could go on and on about how this was developed, but there are one or two important points to note. This line here, you can see, is the number 9 line, the long way round line to Königshütte, which caused such trouble for the Kramer Company, but eventually did open and is still running, as indeed is virtually everything else. I mentioned earlier the Lipini line, this blue dotted line going through Schlesiengrube. This had been the subject of some acrimony between the local authorities and the tramway companies, who by this time were reluctant to pay for road improvements and such like. Eventually it was built as a stub line and didn't go through to connect at Lipini with the main line. Eventually resolution was reached. They split the cost of the street lighting 50-50 between the local authority and the tramway company, and the line was built right through. It remains, amazingly, to this day, an important little link line. The running time from one end to the other is only 3 to 4 minutes, but it carries quite intensive traffic, particularly at school's time. And part of the route, the central part at Schlesiengrube, is still quite built up and very characteristic of mining territory. I also should mention the first development after the AEG bought the company. By 1910, the narrow gauge had clearly reached the limits of its usefulness. The rolling stock was getting a bit decrepit, and the prospect of building a huge system of narrow gauge was not really feasible. And AEG came along and offered to purchase, and not only to purchase, but to make heavy investment in the Upper Silesian tramways. They could see great potential here, and a purchase was agreed in 1910. And the purchase involved investment in not just the track, but also the rolling stock, but also a proposal for a complete regauging of the network and a policy that all future lines would be built to standard gauge. The first one of those was this little line here south from the centre of Katowice, built as a sop really to Katowice Town Council, a recreational line. It opened in 1912, and it was the first of what became a big network of standard gauge lines. And thereafter, plans were prepared for the re-gauging of the whole of the rest of the system. But something called the First World War intervened and prevented any development of that plan for many years. And it wasn't until the late 1920s that progress could be made. The only other thing to mention is a rare example of the company having got its traffic assessment wrong. They'd in 1901 opened a connecting line between Ruderhammer on this vital line between Zabrze and Boyton. That was and is a very important connection between the two centres, and they'd opened this connection line through Ruda to meet up with the Kramer line at Karl Emanuel Colony, but traffic didn't materialise to the extent that they had predicted, and there came a point when the company wanted to cut its losses and couldn't just take the service off. It had to apply to the railway commissioners, Oppeln, to discontinue the service. This was unheard of. The railway commissioners had not heard of anybody wanting to abandon a tramway. Their job was to approve new lines. So they sent a delegation to Zabrze and Morgan Road to find out what on earth was going on. And the delegation went back and said, yeah, actually, the company is right. There is next to no traffic on that line, and you can't reasonably expect them to continue to run it. So authority was given, and the service ceased in 1907, only to be resuscitated in 1960, and then later abandoned again in 2015. So it's had a very, very checkered history, that line, but it's been opened twice and closed twice. So anyway, we've got the story to the First World War and the opening of the standard gauge line, but there is one more important development to mention. So next, please. And here's a view of the standard gauge line in Katowice, I think passing the post office. Yes, it is passing the post office. These little two-axle cars were the normal performers on this short route in standard gauge route, and indeed they were the only ones that were converted for use on it initially. Next, please. A depot was built for these standard gauge cars at Syd Park, South Park, in Katowice. A nice little 3-road depot capable of accommodating 15 cars, and all nicely laid out as you would expect. And there it is, a view from between the wars. Next, please. And I mentioned that there was one more big development. Now, right from 1893, when the company had first been to see the mayor and corporation of Boyton to get their okay for the laying of their tram tracks, it had raised in the mind of the Boyton councillors the possibility that they themselves should run a tramway for the benefit of their local people. But over the next 20 years, they couldn't agree as to whether this company or that promoter should do the job. There were several attempts at reaching agreements, all of which foundered. And in the end, in, I think, 1908, the council decided to take the bull by the horns and it would do the job itself. And again, there was an awful lot of huffing and puffing because there were question marks over whether the whole thing would be economic. But in 1913, the Städtische Straßenbahn Beuthen opened its tracks without any ceremony whatsoever. People went out for a stroll on a Sunday morning and found the trams running. And the corporation ran initially 3 routes, quickly reduced to 2. One of them, quite a prospectively good main line to the rural area to the west. The other one, a local line, and the third one basically providing a service along the track that led to the depot, which proved to be totally unremunerative and was quickly abandoned and not resuscitated until the Second World War. This is a view in the centre of Old Beuthen, with Beuthen Town Hall there in the background. This is one of the buildings that succumbed, well, 80 years ago to this day or yesterday, when Soviet troops invaded Beuthen and ransacked the town. And a lot of its attractive old buildings, like the town hall that you see there from 1856, was completely burnt out. Next, please. You'll hear more about the Beuthen Corporation tramways as the story unfolds. Here's a view in the centre of Beuthen. Somebody's taken a really good shot here, showing both operators and both gauges. On the left, going into Bahnhofstrasse, is a bogie car of the company heading back on one of the long routes, possibly going through to Misrovitz. And on the right, coming in from the SSB lines to the west of Beuthen, is one of their 4-wheel cars. This is at the point known as Boulevard, the layout of which is still recognizable today, although the track layout has changed a bit. Next, please. Here's a close-up of one of the Beuthen Corporation 4-wheel cars. They tended to buy from the manufacturers in Wrocław, Linke Hoffmann, but they also bought from, no, that's gone now. No, I'm sorry, you've lost me there, but they had 2 sources of rolling stock, but Linke Hoffmann was the main one. Next, please. This is a view at the what I call the park terminus, or the recreational terminus of the Beuthen, the SSB tram route, the main one, up to Stadtwald. And they used to have very heavy recreational traffic at weekends, somewhere for the good burghers of Beuthen to get out of the grime of the city and the oppression of the war years, out to somewhere where they could play. Next, please. There's another view of one of the little Beuthen cars. The Boyton cars were originally delivered with big side windows, and they obviously didn't find favour because by the time this view was taken, it had been converted to a 6-window car. Apparently that happened to most of them. Next, please. This map, you can see at the top left there in green, the original lines of the Städtische Straßenbahn Boyton, the main line to Mechrowitz, and then the branch from Calf to Stadtwald, which other than at weekends was normally operated as a single car shuttle. Next, please. This is a view in Gleiwitz. Next, please. This is a view in Zabrze during track reconstruction. Now, the plans to re-gauge the original narrow gauge network were dusted down in about 1923 and worked up into a program for complete conversion. But of course, something of great significance had happened before they could be implemented. After the end of the First World War, what we now call Poland came into existence again. It hadn't been. The whole territory that we're talking about was in Germany, and Germany having been defeated or signed the armistice at the end of the First World War, there were major changes. The empires fell. Of course, the Austrian, the Russian, and the German empires all fell. And the tramway, or rather the whole area here, was the source of great dispute. The problem being basically that the industry, which provided the great wealth, had been developed with German capital and managed by German staff, but had been worked by Polish people. And in the plebiscite, which followed the end of the war, in which it was intended to work out whether the area should join Poland, New Poland, or stay with Germany, it caused great dissent. Some were in favour of one, some the other. And in the end, a plebiscite was held under international supervision, in which 3 of the former areas of Prussia opted to stay in Germany, and the rest decided to join New Poland. The 3 that decided to remain with Germany were Gleiwitz, Boyton, and I don't normally forget this. Gleiwitz, Boyton, and
Zabrze.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
And Zabrze as well.
Yes. And the rest of the territory went to Poland. That meant that the territory was divided, and so too was the tramway. As from 1922-23, the Polish section became a self-governing tramway operation and took over quite a lot of the rolling stock, proportionate to what the combined operation had been before, whereas the operations in Gleiwitz, Zabrze, and Boyton remained under German control. And the proposal for regaging only really found I would say favour, but practicality in the German partition, because they had more access to finance, which was very necessary. Polish partition was very cash-strapped, and although it made an attempt to start regaging, it didn't get very far. As far as the German partition was concerned, work started in Gleiwitz in 1928 and gradually worked east. And actually, the work was apparently done with cars running right up to the railhead. So passengers going, shall we say, from Gleiwitz to Zabrze found themselves changing cars between those of one gauge and those of another at different points a whole series of days. So the work must have been quite efficiently carried out. And in addition to this, new rolling stock was ordered, inevitably, to run on the standard gauge of much higher quality, higher motored cars, very smart, fully enclosed. And by the early 1930s, the tram tracks in the German partition were in a very good state, in contrast to those in the Polish partition, where only very, very slow progress was made. And really, by about 1931, when the financial crisis hit, then things had to be brought to a halt. I'm going to have to accelerate a bit, or we'll not get finished within the time. One thing I want to highlight is a very interesting situation that arose on the cross-country route between Zabrze and Beuthen. The tramway, as I say, had to be divided between the two powers, and there were 7 interchange points at which the Polish and the German operations met. Initially, there was some through running, but there was an awful lot of bad feeling with alleged smuggling and so forth. And in the end, control points were instituted at all 7 of them, at which, in most cases, passengers had to get off, walk through the frontier point, and be subject to searches if necessary, and then board another tram on the other side. This was all very inconvenient, and particularly so was it inconvenient on this trunk line between Zabrze and Beuthen. Because there, as with everywhere else, it hadn't mattered before the war where the lines had been drawn between the various municipal boundaries. That was not of great concern. Now it took on great importance, and between Biskupice and Bobrek, the tram line went out from Germany into Poland for a distance of about 1,300 meters, and then back into Germany again as it went back into the area administered by Beuthen. This was most inconvenient, and with the long delays at each customs point, passengers were subject to a great delay. And the German authorities decided that in order to stop this nonsense, they would build a new road. And they did. They built a road between the outskirts of Biskupice, near where the tram turning circle is now, and the point where they re-entered German territory at Bobrek. And they built this new road on land that was just within the German boundary. And a new tram line was laid alongside it as part of this construction work, double track, very, very advanced for Upper Silesia. And in November 1930, the route was reopened using this road, which was christened the Umgehungsstraße, the diversion or the going around route, which was rather nice. And of course, it avoided serving this little section of Polish territory, which had caused all the problems. On the main north-south line between Königshütte and Deutsch-Pekar, a different situation arose where the tram was mainly operated in Polish territory, but entered the Beuthen boundary and went through the territory of Beuthen before re-emerging into Poland. In order to serve this line, corridor trams were instituted, where armed guards travelled on each platform, and the doors to the saloons were sealed as the cars went through German territory, and passengers were not allowed to board or alight in that area. This went on. This was a provision of the Geneva Accords of 1922, and there were 5 or 6 journeys a day which operated this type of corridor operation. Of course, there was still a need to serve the German population in the Beuthen corridor, but it couldn't be done with the same trams, and that was done using trams at the company based in Beuthen, or running through Beuthen, which operated locally between Beuthen station and the boundary at Karlsfreudegrube. The situation here was simplified to some extent when the narrow gauge used for the Beuthen line was regauged in 1935, and at that point the tunnel constructed in 1894 ceased to operate, and all trams of both gauges were put onto the new tracks laid on the surface. However, it wasn't the end of narrow gauge operation in Beuthen, because when the narrow gauge was replaced, it was also decided, for operational simplicity, to regauge the section north towards Deutsch-Pekar as far as Rosberg depot, so that depot workings could conveniently be operated by the standard gauge cars. The line to Deutsch-Pekar, which lay in Poland, was not regauged, so there was dual gauge track, and the service to Deutsch-Pekar continued to be worked by the narrow gauge. That was closed in 1937 when the Geneva Accords ceased to apply. It was an abrupt removal of the facility, and the narrow gauge to Deutsch-Pekar was closed. And I think everybody must have forgotten that there was, in fact, about 400 yards of track from Rosberg depot north to the international boundary, which was still laid only in narrow gauge. And therefore, a narrow gauge operation still had to be maintained from Rosberg depot just to cover that section. So the service was run from Pogoda north on the line to Deutsch-Pekar, but only as far as the international boundary. Now, other things happened elsewhere on the network, and I haven't yet mentioned the Coalfield Tramway, but I think I'll do, because we're moving up to the time where we must bring tonight's talk to a close, is just to cover the remaining regauging, because this was very interesting. By 1941, the regauging program had got quite far advanced, and it had left an interesting situation with Line 9, which was now operated in 3 separate sections. Standard gauge to the extreme north, standard gauge from Königshütte through to Antonienhütte, and a residual narrow gauge section in the middle. And in order to work this, the tramway had to erect a temporary depot on mining company land at Antonienhütte to house the half dozen or so cars that were necessary to work the central section of the route. This became all very difficult, particularly after an incident only 3 or 4 days into the war, when the railway bridge at Morgenrot was damaged by sabotage, and it was not possible to bring cars from the one remaining depot that could work narrow gauge cars conveniently, that was at Wargiewnicki, because they were not able to pass under the bridge. And apparently, in order to maintain a service to the coal mines, a series of parked up spare narrow gauge cars were brought using railway type skates round via Zabrze from the depot at Rosberg and transferred to narrow gauge lines at the interchange at Morgenrot and operated from a temporary stabling point in the open at Morgenrot for several days until the track under the bridge could be reopened. This had highlighted to the authorities, the German authorities, the necessity of keeping the tramway running, but the difficulties of doing so with 2 gauges and all the problems of the wartime economy. And it was decided to accelerate the regauging program, even though it was going to be very difficult in wartime conditions. And this meant that the whole of the line from Morgenrot through to Königshütte, the 4 would be regauged. And in addition to that, it was realized that they would have to regauge the little line through Lipiny, which had never been considered for regauging, because without doing so, it would have been impossible to get any cars to and from a depot capable of still working narrow gauge stock. So that too was done in 1941, and here we are, right in the darkest days of the war for all parties. Money is found to relay the track, to regauge it for quite a lengthy section, actually, and also, as I say, on the little line through Lipiny. Once that was done, it left the remainder of the old Kramer main line to the north from Königshütte through to Beuthen to be relayed, and that was done. That was converted in 1942, and towards the end of 1942, the narrow gauge service as a residual line as far as Rosberg depot and the international boundary just beyond was taken off. The track was apparently forced out. This was done in certain places. It wasn't always the policy to do so, but the existing track was forced out so that it could be used by standard gauge cars. And from the 12th of December 1942, narrow gauge operation in Beuthen came to an end. And that completed the narrow gauge conversion in both the German and the Polish partitions, except for the isolated line 12 that linked Königshütte with Laurahütte. And for that, a fleet, quite an extensive fleet of narrow gauge bogie cars was retained at Wargiewnicki depot, with narrow gauge dual gauge track between there and Königshutter to run that service and to convert it as soon as possible once resources were available. Well, they weren't quickly available, and it was in fact 1952 before the job could be finished. If we could just have some last photos then, please, Roberto, the next one. View at I have a feeling that is at Łagiewnik depot, but I'm not certain. Not certain. I'll have a note of it somewhere, but not on my meeting notes. Next, please. This was a new office block for the tramway company, opened in 1931 to replace the old OKE offices and depot, which had been built for the narrow gauge and were on the opposite side of the railway line, also in Bismarck-Hütte. Next, please. This is the line to that depot at Hortsov-Batory today, accessed by a sinuous single track under the mainline railway. Next, please. This is the tramway station at Bytom, or Boyton as it was then, which was opened in 1930 as part of the reorganisation of tramway movements in Boyton to replace the big town loop that had been introduced in 1905. And this tram station, of course, is still in use today. Next, please. And here's another view in Boyton. This is one of the so-called Bremen cars, was built in the 1930s for the company. Next, please. And here's a view in the centre of Gleiwitz, passing the City Hall, actually, with motor and trailer car there on a service to or from Voithova-Wies. Next, please. Oh, the tramway company also ran a railway, which is outside the scope of this talk, but linked Gleiwitz with Ratibor, and went from Trinec, and the trams also terminated at Trinec, and in latter years, before their line was regauged, they were shedded at the railway yard at Trinec. Next, please. There's a view on the standard gauge line in Katowice. Next, please. And I think a rather wonderful view at the centre of what by then had been renamed Hindenburg. This is Zabrze. Zabrze was paid a state visit by the Kaiser in 1915, who graciously bestowed upon them the renaming of their town as Hindenburg, after the great general's great military victories. And it remained so until 1945, when the town decided it would rather revert to Zabrze, which it retains today. The trams that you see in the foreground are on a local line introduced in Hindenburg in 1934 under the auspices of the town council, but always operated on their behalf by the tramway company and integrated in part of their network. The trams going left and right are on the old Kramer line from Gleiwitz to Königshütte. Next, please. Here's a map of 1929, which shows you the way things were going at that stage. Some lines relayed to standard gauge. The solid lines, solid red line, for example, on the left as far as Poręba, is standard gauge, and Poręba is the boundary between Zabrze and Ruda Śląska, which obstinately decided to stay in Poland, and its land jutted out into the land retained by Germany quite significantly, and Ruda Śląska was the cause of several of the interchange points that had to be introduced during the interwar period. Next, please. This is the interchange at Poręba. Looks all very civilized there, but they weren't all, apparently. Next, please. And this is one on the main north-south route between Königshütte and Beuthen. This would be at Karlsfreude Grube. Next, please. And that's actually a view of the same interchange point taken from a different angle, and I think a bit later. Next, please. Oof. The conductor there, or maybe he's the representative of the armed forces, is pointing to the destination plate, which indicates that it is a corridor tram going through to Königshütte. Next, please. This is the Umgehungsstraße with its parallel tram line, built by the German authorities and opened in 1930. And until very recently, by which I mean last year, this was a very long non-stop run. Between Bobrek and Biskupitz was 1.9 kilometers, and trams could get up a fair old speed here. But since then, a request stop has been introduced following the introduction of the first piece of commercial development alongside this line. Next, please. Here's one of these magnificent bogie cars built in the early 1930s for operation mainly on the main line between Beuthen and Gleiwitz, which also featured some express trams. Next, please. And another one, this view taken actually at the stub of track at Pagoda. That's on the shuttle service to Deutsche Picard. Next, please. Another view in Leibitz, passing the City Hall. Next, please. Motor and trailer set of the Bremen type, which had been delivered in the early 1930s as part of the modernization program. Next, please. Several batches of the Bremen cars. This one is on a line introduced in the coalfield, 1935. Next, please. Car. Next, please. And here's a rather dramatic view of one of these new cars, centre entrance car in this case, photographed on the reserve track, probably somewhere near Gleiwitz depot. Next, please. Oof. And standing in the tram station in Bitom. Very smart and quite capacious, I think. Next, please. One of three cars of a later type built called Hortzoff type, actually built at the tram works at Hortzoff. Next, please. Another. Several of these lasted until well in the post-war era. Next, please. An interesting acquisition by the company in 1938 were a couple of these bogie cars, maximum traction bogie cars, actually, the first ones ever to operate down this tramway. And they came from the closed Kostrin coastline. Next, please. There's another view of one. These were seriously underpowered, and an eyewitness recalls seeing one unable to get up the hill in the centre of Boyton one Christmas Eve. Next, please. This is a view again of Boyton Town Hall. Next, please. And another different car of Boyton in the marketplace at Boyton. Next, please. This is a view actually in Katowice with a motor and trailer set going through to Sosnowiec. Now, I haven't actually mentioned about the development of tramways in what they call the coal field, and I'll very briefly do that, although we're running out of time rapidly. And after 1918, lands that have previously been under Tsarist jurisdiction to the east of Upper Silesia were transferred to Poland. They contain rich mineral resources which had never been properly exploited, but they are not technically Upper Silesia. And even today, the Poles make it quite clear where Upper Silesia ends, and the coalfield tramway is something quite separate and indeed has a character all of its own. Next, please. This is track laying under the railway bridge at Sosnowiec, under which the road had to be lowered to allow the passage of trams through from Katowice. Opened in 1931. Next, please. This is the depot for the coalfield tramway. The depot was at Benzine, and this is, as I say, a tramway. It still runs, but its character is completely different, very Soviet character, and it's almost all reserved track. It was first opened in 1928. Next, please. And one of the magnificent English electric bogie cars that were ordered for the opening of the coalfield tramway, some of which was still running in 1970. Next, please. Another view of one of these English electric cars in Dąbrowa Górnicza, which is one of the principal settlements served by the tramway. Next, please. An English electric trailer parked up at Sosnowiec station, waiting to be picked up by a motor car, normally motor and trailer, on the services between Sosnowiec and the coalfield. Next, please. When the new local line 24 was opened in 1935, the company ordered 4 new 4-wheel motor cars to operate it. And here's one of them, although it's blinded up for Shopenica, which was not on the 24. The 24 was effectively the local line in Sosnowiec. Local, please. Next, please. This is a view of the track relaying and regauging taking place at Rossbach, Beuthen in 1935, where new dual gauge track was laid to replace the track in the 1894 tunnel, which you can just make out to the left behind the first rank of railings. Next, please. Here's another map to show how things were in 1936 as the regauging was proceeding, and also the SSB had opened a number of extensions. That's the Beuthen Corporation lines. Next, please. Later on, some of the cars displaced through new rolling stock arriving for regauging work themselves were transferred to work on services which have previously been worked by older stock. Next, please. Again, this is at, I'm fairly certain that that's on the Katowice, the short Katowice line. You'll notice that the German swastika is flying from the roof and indeed on the dash. Next, please. And here's a bogey car working on the standard gauge line in Katowice. Next, please. Interesting view at Königshütte with cars taking layover there. And as you can see, they are on the narrow gauge track, so they are on the Polish services. Next, please. This is the regauged part of line 9, which was between Königshütte and Antonienhütte. As far as the regauging got before the work had to stop. Next, please. And this is the state of the track in December 1942, when the regauging operation was complete, except for the central section of line 9 and line 12 to Laurahütte. Next, please. A second-hand acquisition, one of many that came to Katowice in the later stages of the war. They came from a wide variety of places. I haven't checked where this one came from, but there were over 140 cars, motors and trailers, that came to help out here because of the increased demands placed upon the tramway with all the war working. Next, please. Later in the war, the company took delivery of a small number of KSW cars, motors and trailers, 9 motors and a similar number of trailers. And this is one in wartime condition at Horzów Batory, awaiting to enter service. Next, please. Also, now on the Coalfield tramway, an image of one of the great bogey cars imported there for operation on line 24. Next, please. I know that this is our last photograph tonight, and it is a particularly important one. It's very, very rare. It's a view of a standard gauge motor car towing a narrow gauge motor car on railway skates. It has appeared in a German book. It was claimed to be seen somewhere near Laurahütte, but I gave it to one of my Polish experts, who looked at it very carefully and said, no, it's definitely not. It's somewhere around Łagiewniki, between Boyton and the Kramer line. And the reason is because of the type of bracket arm used. You can see behind the narrow gauge car with the slightly ornate scroll work. He said that is typical of the company that laid that line, and also the double headstocks to the left of the motor car is indicative of a particular colliery on that section of route. But it's a very interesting view. I've never seen a view of a tram being hauled on skates before, and I just wish we had a date and a precise location. Anyway, gentlemen, I'm going to call a halt there tonight. I hope I haven't gone on too long and bored you too much with this story. I want to thank the Euro Sprinter who kindly agreed to the use of several of the photographs, and to the VDVA archive, which was an absolute treasure trove of materials, some of which I don't think they really knew the value of what they got. And also to Roger Smith, who very kindly prepared the maps, which I've taken from my book. Thank you very much and good night.